Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Ryan Craig's play, How to Think the Unthinkable, which is one of the most interesting Antigone adaptations that I've read in a good long while, and I've read a good number of Antigone adaptations. Craig's version is really fascinating because he keeps the basic storyline of Polynices has died trying to retake the crown of Thebes. His body is lying unburied at Creon's edict. Antigone goes and buries it. She gets caught. She refuses to play along or compromise in any way with Creon. He has her walled up. She dies. Haemon dies. Eurydice dies. And when I say dies, in all the three of these cases, I mean kill themselves. And then Creon realizes he's been destroyed by fate at the end. So that basic storyline is there. But within this version, there are a lot of really interesting changes. Some characters get a lot more focus. So the soldiers who are guarding Polynices' body get a lot more focus. Ismene gets more focus. Haemon gets a lot more focus. Eurydice gets a ton more focus. And then, interestingly enough, Tiresias is taken out. So I want to talk about some of these differences. So, starting right from the beginning, we have these three soldiers, Tom, Roy, and Bo. Tom being the sort of lead soldier. They're really fascinating. Like, the play starts with Tom giving us background, and then we get these interactions between Tom, Bo, and Roy. And they're a sort of vaudeville comedy troupe kind of thing. Like, the way that their dialogue is written, we just have this almost... Like, I think I'd compare it most closely to Abbott and Costello. With these sort of insults and like missing the point and these language games and things like this that these three soldiers are playing. And they're hilarious. So like when Haemon shows up to check on Polynices' body and it's gone, like the three soldiers, so Bo says, "It's Prince Haemon." Roy said, "The king's son." Tom says, "Come to check on the body." Bo says, "We can't let him see it." Roy says, "He'll tell his dad." Tom says, "Stand in front of it." Bo says, "In a line." So, like, their solution to the fact that the body is gone and Haemon is coming to check on it is to sort of stand in front of it. I'm picturing, like, in soccer, or football, as it's called in the UK, like, when... there's certain like penalty kicks or things like that where the players on the defending team will form a wall. Like they'll stand in a line to try and block the shot. Like that's what I'm picturing here, is this like soccer troupe kind of thing to try and block Haemon's view. So they're just really funny. They're comic characters in a way that they aren't in the Sophocles version. And there's actually a lot of humor here that we don't get in Sophocles at all. Creon's even funny. Like at one point, after Tom has brought him the news that Polynices' body is gone, he threatens him. He says about the soldiers, "You're all dead, you hear me? You're all finished. I'll have you torn apart by angry pelicans." I love bizarre threats like that. Like that pelicans are going to be the instrument of their demise. It's such a brilliant, weird line. So the soldiers play a much bigger role in this. Haemon plays a much bigger role throughout the play. Because interestingly, in the Sophocles, he doesn't actually show up until after Antigone has been sentenced. Like, Haemon shows up for the last half of the play, At which point he basically says, hey, Creon, your plan for this edict and the whole burying Antigone alive thing is really not popular, and you shouldn't be doing it. Here we get Haemon from the first act and the first scene coming in, and he has much more confidence in his father's decision than he seems to in the Sophocles. Like he tells the soldiers, even though I am to marry this man's sister, that's Polynices' sister, even though I love Antigone more than it's possible to explain, her brother is still a traitor, and people here should know what happens to those who rise up against the state. And then a little bit later he says, don't you see how important this is? The city's ill at ease. My father has to rule with an iron fist, otherwise all hell could break loose. What would happen to your families then? Because the soldiers are basically saying they don't want to go and tell Creon about this, because Creon will execute them, and then their families will, have a provider executed, which is generally not a good plan. So Haemon basically convinces them to go and tell Creon the truth. And interestingly enough, he pulls the king from Shrek, whose name I can't remember. Because he says, I have to trust my father. He's a decent man. He'll deal fairly and squarely with you if you own up. If you go and tell him the truth. Be honest and he may be merciful. And Bo says, but he might have us killed. Haemon says, that's a chance I'm prepared to take.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
So, other characters who get a lot more stage time, Ismene is one of them. And the way that Craig deals with Ismene, I actually really like, because Ismene is one of my favorite characters in all of Greek tragedy. And I think she often, I think because she is unwilling initially to help Antigone, people often sort of accept Antigone's claim that she's a coward. I actually don't think that she is. I find her fascinating because she seems to me like just a regular person that a bunch of terrible shit just keeps happening to. And I find that so incredibly sympathetic that in these tragedies where people's misfortune is so often brought on themselves, that Ismene is a suffering bystander. And I have so much sympathy for her, and Sophocles doesn't seem to. And a lot of critics who write about, scholars who write about Antigone don't seem to have that much sympathy for Ismene. But here, one of the interesting things is that Antigone has buried Polynices' body, but she hasn't talked to Ismene about it before. Because that's one of the big things in the Sophocles version, is Antigone, early in the play, goes to Ismene and says, help me bury our brother's body. And Ismene says, it's dangerous, it's against the law, there's no good reason to do it. Here, we have, this is Act 1, Scene 2. So it's not super late in the play, but it's a decent ways in. This is the first conversation we see between Antigone and Ismene. We already know that the body has been buried. Ismene says, what do you have to do? Whatever it is, don't. Be sensible. Keep your head down. These are dangerous times. And Antigone says, maybe I've already done it. So in this version, that critique of Ismene, that she refuses to help Antigone, it's completely gone. Which I love so much, because that takes that guilt away from Ismene. Antigone has done what she's done. She's buried Polynices' body without consulting Ismene. But then later, when the soldiers go to brick up Antigone in a cave as her penalty for violating this this edict, Ismene puts up a pretty big fight. Like, she tries to stop them in a way that Antigone doesn't. So that's a really interesting change as well, because in the Sophocles, Ismene kind of drops out as Haemon comes into the story. Here, Ismene is still playing quite an active role. And then she goes to get Haemon to tell him that Antigone is being bricked up in this cave. So she's really still an active part of it. And I love the way that Ismene is dealt with here. The other character who undergoes substantial changes here is Eurydice. Because in the Sophocles version, Eurydice basically shows up at the end to be like, Creon, your actions have led my son to kill himself in this cave over Antigone. Now I'm going to go kill myself off stage. That's basically all that she does in the Sophocles version. Here, she's a major player. Like, Creon is in this tough spot because he has to enforce his edict, otherwise he'll be seen as a weak king, which will open the door to further chaos and civil war. But on the other hand, he really doesn't want to kill Antigone. So Eurydice comes along, and she says, so, this is what you do. You have her walled up, you lock her in a cave, brick it up, seal it completely. She's thrown in there with only a candle and a morsel of food. To all the world, and to Antigone too, it looks as though she's being buried alive, consigned to a long, painful, miserable death, where she will starve or go mad or both. Everyone will fear and respect you. Antigone, well, she'll be so scared she'll beg for forgiveness. She'll do anything to be let out of her death chamber. She'll recant and you will show clemency. The great and powerful and ruthless Creon is also wise and merciful. The greatest king Thebes has ever known. You'll go down in legend. Creon says, legend, you say? Eurydice says, Creon the Great, and only we will know the truth, that you never intended to harm her in the first place. Creon says, there's only one loophole in your plan there, genius. What if she doesn't recant? What if she doesn't beg for forgiveness? What if she stays in there and takes it? I'm going to look pretty mean and stupid while she's wasting away in there, aren't I? And Eurydice says, soon Polynices' body will be totally decomposed. There'll be nothing left to bury. When that happens, you announce the law is rescinded. It's not needed anymore. Therefore, Antigone hasn't done anything illegal. She's free to go. You're golden. This is actually a pretty clever plan. And it's Eurydice's plan. It's not Creon's plan in this version. What's interesting about it, apart from the fact that it doesn't work, and actually the reason it doesn't work is because because Antigone gets Tom to give her his dagger before she gets walled up so that she kills herself while she's in there. But Eurydice didn't know that was going to happen. But the thing that's interesting about it is that later in the play, Creon admits that he feels uneasy about things. And Eurydice critiques him. And she basically says, you should have been a moral leader who stood up for what was right rather than passing the edict just because it was popular. So she says, you should have stood up to them. You're supposed to be their king. You should have been their leader, not been led by them. When you do what the mob wants, you're nowhere. So that's an interesting sort of anti-democracy sentiment, which I'm not hugely on board with. But Eurydice then says, you had the power to change things and you didn't have the courage. You didn't have the moral vision. I thought you were a big enough man to be king, but I was wrong. You tried to look strong by being harsh, and it's all a fake. And Creon quite rightly points out that this scheme Eurydice has come up with to kill Antigone without killing her is itself a fake. So we've got that interesting sort of dichotomy there. But also in this portion where Eurydice criticizes Creon for not having the moral courage to stand up against the will for revenge, the popular will for revenge. She takes on that role of Tiresias and saying, you did this wrong. But it's definitely not the same kind of moral guilt. It's you made a strategic mistake as opposed to you've made an ethical error. So that's an interesting turn that we get here. And the last thing I want to talk about very briefly is Antigone herself. Now, I'm actually not a big fan of Sophocles' Antigone, in part because she's so popular, in part because people often love Antigone and see her as this sort of liberatory, anti-establishment, anti-authoritarian force, and I don't really see her that way. I see her as someone whose ethics are fairly arbitrary. But anyway, I don't want to talk that much about Antigone as such. But in this play, one of the interesting contradictions of her character is that she asserts to Ismene that she can't lie, that she refuses to lie. She refuses to recant because it would be untrue, and that she is only responsible for her own actions. The choices that others make, even if they affect her, are not her responsibility. And she asserts that everyone should do what's right regardless of what the consequences are. This is, of course, the Kantian argument, the Kantian categorical imperative, right, of you have to do the right thing, you have to be honest under all circumstances regardless of the consequences. But then Tom comes, the guard, comes to take her away and wall her up. And Antigone says it's not his fault. He's only doing his job. He'll be killed if he doesn't obey. Now that's true. If Tom doesn't bury Antigone according to Creon's orders, he will be killed. That's fair. But it's interesting that she prefaces that justification with, it's not his fault. He's given the Kantian ethical argument that she just laid out for Antigone a few lines earlier. It is in fact Tom's fault. He knows that it's wrong to bury Antigone, and yet he's going to do it anyway because he is worried about the consequences, because he is worried about someone else's actions. Now, it's a fair thing to be worried about, and he has a wife and kids, and that's legit. But according to the ethical stance that Antigone and Kant would take, he's still not right. It is his fault. He is still making the wrong moral choice here. And so it is interesting that Antigone wants to let Tom off the hook for making an unethical choice because the consequences would be undesirable, but she refuses to grant herself the same luxury.